looking across to all these different portals and all these different creatures, all these different tech, all these different weapons, all this different crap coming through. I was in stunned silence like everyone else. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Was this real? Could they have possibly all come to us to bring us all sorts of pain? What the hell was going on? And then I felt the hand on my arm. Cassie was also in fear as she looked up. She had grabbed onto my arm out of just a reaction, but it was enough to bring me back to reality. I looked at her again. I must have had fear in my eyes as she had sheer panic in hers. And then I thought for a second, the family. Oh shit, I have to protect the family. I asked Cassie if she could open a portal as well, since that was dark energy. She just looked at me. Yeah, of course. And then she opened a portal right to my brother's house. As soon as we walked through, I could feel a strange energy coming through as well. I looked around and I could feel different type of portals opening up all around. And I started screaming for everyone, "Where are you? Where are you? Where are you?" They all started to come out, all of them wondering what the hell was going on. Unfortunately, my brother was still at work, so I called him as soon as I could. I also started calling my brothers and sisters, all my family as much as I could. I needed them to be stationary so we could go and get them and bring them to one spot so we could protect them. However, they didn't exactly need as much protection as I thought. I looked over and my youngest niece, who I had thought had no magic ability, had apparently started studying on her own to create her own style of magic. It was a type of what's known as gray magic. It wasn't exactly holy magic, nor was it dark energy. However, it was more than enough to knock down a few of those that had come to harm us. She looked right into Alamia's eyes as it started to slither extremely fast, and she let out a burst of energy that sent that snake bitch flying into the air. I still remember her screaming as she ended up in the neighbor's tree. Unfortunately, my young niece, even though she made a strong attack, had not understood the abilities she had and how draining they truly are, as she dropped to her knees and puked right there. Thankfully, her mother was right there to take her. It was at this point that we opened up different portals and screamed at all the family to come in so we could protect them. Us men, of course, being protectors by nature, we went outside as we saw different creatures begin to roam the streets. We could hear screams of pain and horror and the occasional one of, was that pleasure? It didn't matter. We didn't care. I wanted to bring them together so that I could protect them. I raised myself into the air so that I could get a better look at what was going on. I could see a few things moving around in the distance, but nothing had really showed up in mass where we were. At most, we had to deal with a few of the Lamias that had been in the area. However, it wasn't just them. I looked and I could see a mass of goblins making their way across. They busted into different buildings and they began to do what goblins do. They didn't just steal, they didn't just assault, they didn't just hurt people. They did, however, hurt them in different ways. And yes, those were screams of pain and pleasure. Not at the same time, mind you. I suddenly had a pinch of fear as I looked beneath me and I saw not only my nieces, my sisters, my mother, my sisters-in-law, and even I saw Cassie there as she realized what was going on. Though she did not elevate herself with me, she was there to protect everyone else on the ground. I suddenly feared for them beyond all reason. And I looked over and I could not focus on the goblins as I had another problem. The Lamias were trying to fight their way through my shield. However, my shield, even though it protected more than a few city blocks worth, there was still plenty of food for them. And I could still hear screaming. I wanted to go help. I needed to go help. I screamed to everyone, "I have to go help everyone out. Can you protect them?" He screamed yes. And I was off. and started blasting at the Lamias with any type of energy I can get my hands on. It didn't matter if it was electricity. It didn't matter if it was some sort of fire. Hell, I used water from a pool to send one flying that had already eaten the neighbor's dog and was already looking for its next meal. These Lamias seemed to, every time they eat, they got bigger and bigger. And I don't mean girthier. I mean they got genuinely larger, longer, and seemingly stronger than they were before. Their digestive capability seemed to have no bounds with everything they put down their maw and just swallowed it whole. Many times I would come across one that had still legs kicking as they went down. There wasn't much I could do except slice the Lamia open and try to get the person out. And then I felt it, the one thing I did not ever want to fear. I knew that feeling, though. It was Cassie. Since we had become one in soul, I could tell when she was in trouble, so I rushed back, and I could see that goblins were beginning to surround the house. Unfortunately, one of them had got a hold of some sort of weapon, and I got hit on the way down. Thankfully, I could begin to heal myself. And then one ran over, but stopped suddenly as it looked at my niece. My niece then stood up, but then dropped down to her knees and wrapped her arms around her body as she shook. The goblin began to smile and drool as it walked closer and closer, and then suddenly dropped to its knees and began to seemingly convulse. I didn't know what the hell was going on. I made my way over just as Cassie had made it over to my niece, and I looked over, and Cassie looked at me and said, "Don't worry, she's not hurt." I looked at her. She was still on her knees, grasping her abdomen and just shaking. Her wings were sprawled out almost straight to the sky, and her tail was poked almost straight back. I'm like, if she's not hurt, what's wrong? Cassie looked at me and gave a sly grin. I didn't understand at that moment, but I would as soon as a whole gaggle of other goblins showed up, a mixture of male and female, as they began to start charging the area the house was in. I looked over and began to swell up energy, and then I heard my niece scream. But it wasn't a scream of pain as her head jolted back and pointed to the sky as her eyes rolled back. I suddenly realized what was going on. Cassie again was trying to tell me without telling me, but I knew what was going on now. My niece was a succubus, and these goblins were all about lust, and every time they lusted, even the desire itself flowed more energy into her body. Any succubus must have been feeling the same way across the planet, and for most of them, this sudden rush must have been almost debilitating, as they couldn't move as their body began to clench with all the feelings that was going through. They didn't have to even be close to the act, the desire for it to go into them. The power from every single thought that went through, every single desire that they wanted to do to her was making her stronger, yet she could not handle the power that was going through, as the power was based in lust itself. I lowered myself over and asked, what do we do? Can we stop them? There's so many. I don't think I got the abilities to kill them all or keep them all back forever. Then Cassie looked at me and said, "Don't worry, I've got this one." She grabbed my niece by the face and leaned over and kissed her deeply and passionately. I was like, "We're in the middle of a war. What the fuck are you doing?" Then I felt the energy. It was a simple energy transfer. I didn't think of that myself because I'm more of a healer. I'm not in the dark arts, and energy transfers are more in the dark arts. Then Cassie herself disconnected from my niece. Her eyes rolled back in her head, and she fell back, and I could see that she was flinching the same way I've seen other times, but this time much more violently. I reached over for Cassie, and I realized that my niece had suddenly regained herself. She realized what was going on. As I held Cassie, I looked over to her, and I told her, "You are a succubus. You control this. It does not control you." She looked at me, and she could feel the power still radiating into her body. And as other goblins came up and they began to get closer and closer without dropping this time, she realized what was going on. As the power radiated through her, I could also see that her body was growing. It was growing more voluptuous, more distinct. The horns on her head began to stretch farther back, almost like that of a crown a queen would wear. And it hit me what was going on. She raised her wings and then stretched them out to the sides, but she did not have to flap her wings as she elevated herself above the house 5, 10, 20, 50 feet. As she got up, Cassie began to calm down. I waved my sister-in-law and her daughter over. I said, hey, watch her. I went to raise myself up over towards my niece, but I got deflected by some sort of energy barrier similar to my own. She looked at me and she waved her hand no. She then, with some sort of booming voice, a mix of teleportation and projecting her own voice, she screamed out, "Bow to your queen." And with that, everything in the area that was surrounded by goblins stopped. The goblins all seemed to come out in a trance. It seemed like every single male goblin on the entire planet was making its way over. And as they got close to the house, they simply got down on one knee and lowered their heads as though they were paying homage to her. And every time they raised their head to look, you could see the power. It was getting so dense now, it was visible. She was getting stronger. Oh, shit. Her name's not Lilith, so I wondered what the hell was going to happen. However, with that, as her power raised up and the goblins themselves all began to show up in ships, but the ships themselves did not fire. They simply showed up and landed wherever they could, even if that meant landing on their own. It did not matter. They landed right there, got out of their ships, and again got down on one knee and began to placate to her. If she asked them to lay down their lives right then and there, I'm sure they would. But as it seemed like fewer and fewer were showing up, as they began to just simply walk up and drop to one knee, I noticed something. More than 80% were men, male goblins. There were very few females. I didn't understand this. It was strange to me. I didn't put two and two together at this point, nor did I give a shit. Reason being is then my niece not only had her set of wings that now stretched a good 25 feet each side, but sprouted a second set of wings that made her almost angelic. As all four wings spread out, I could feel the power as it began to push me away. She simply looked at me and said, "Thank you for your guidance." This was strange. She was 15 years old and has never spoken like that. How the hell would she speak so adult-like? It was strange. And then she simply raised her hand and opened a huge portal, not 20 feet on the other side of the road. It almost engulfed the front of the house over there. And she said, "Let us return." And all the goblins that were there simply got up and got in their machines or walked and simply went through the portal. I could see to the other side. It was the goblins' home planet. I know they have several, but this was their home planet. And she simply was walking right into the front of the gates of their empire building. I was amazed by this. How could she master this so well? I flew up to her, and this time I fought my way through the energy. I looked her in the eye, and I realized that she now had a full-on body of a 24-year-old supermodel. everything radiated desire, a unending desire, something that we would see amongst men who would never have gotten any attention from a woman, and then this gorgeous woman pays attention to them. We all know what we call them now. And she simply led her army back to its home planet. I was standing face to face to her, and I wanted to say goodbye. I didn't know if I would see her again, if she was still the niece that I had helped raise. And then she reached out and gave me a hug. I reached my arms around her back to give her a tight hug. And she said, "Say goodbye to Mom and Dad for me, okay?" I have to admit, I cried a little bit. I did not know if this was goodbye forever or not. All I knew is that for some reason she had mastered this ability within minutes. I didn't know how. I didn't care to know how at that point. I just wanted to know she would be safe. But since this war had not made its way to the goblins' world, I knew she would be. I just hoped she would be able to maintain her now ability to control lust itself. The goblins were now almost completely through the portal, as several of their ships just flew by, straight into the portal and straight back to their planet. I let go, and she also seemed to be sad. I had to back myself away as I realized that my body was beginning to feel the power that she was radiating off. I remember she is still my blood, and those thoughts, those desires are never to be. I looked at her again, trying to keep the tears at bay, and she flew away, more like levitated, as she did not have to move her wings at all. And she said nothing as she floated away into the portal. She was facing me as she floated backwards into the portal itself, and with a small wave of her hand, the portal itself closed in a matter of moments. I lowered myself down and had to explain to her parents what had happened. That was not a conversation I was looking forward to, but one of the invading armies had now been taken care of without any additional bloodshed. Yet, for some reason, I could still hear the screaming, and then realized we were not out of the woods yet. We still had those snake bitches to deal with. And as I levitated up, surprisingly, I was followed by Cassie, who had somehow managed to figure it out. I didn't think she was able to levitate, but apparently she can. She followed me around as we began to knock back the snake women, but we found out really quick that people around the world had not taken kindly to these things coming and taking their loved ones, and we could hear the shots begin to fire. It had only been maybe a half an hour since the entire thing started. I'm amazed it took this long. Oh, then again, considering the state we're in, not a lot of people are allowed to be armed. But those that were taking the fight back to them. And this is what I meant by we do not fight alone. Within another half an hour of fighting, I could see human aircraft, F-16s, F-15s, and the occasional F-22 whipping through the skies as they were bringing ordnance over to take care of the larger ships and the larger vessels that were coming through the portals. What I did not know at the time is that the portals had not shut, and even more and more were coming through. I shiver at the thought right now, knowing how much of them were coming, but I had my own problems. We had to clear the area and save as many civilians as possible. But then I got a call. And it was another magic user, a friend of mine named Billy. And he simply said, "You gotta get the hell over here, man. We're being overrun." Where? He sent me a telepathic link to know where. And I was, okay, I'll be there as soon as I can. With that, I grabbed a hold of Cassie's arm, and she looked at me and smiled and stopped me and said, "There's a faster way." "What? What do you mean?" Raising her hand, she opened a portal very similar to what we had seen before. Again, this is darker magic, and I'm not sure how it works. And then we simply went through. Cassie went through without a problem. I flinched a little as that stings. That stings a lot, actually. Yet in a moment, we were right where we needed to be, right in the middle of the fight. And what I saw terrified me, as 3 of the armies were seemingly coming down onto the planet. They were pretty well spread out. As the vampires made their way across Europe, we saw the ogres had come straight towards the US, and they had wanted a piece of us. Hell, they wanted the whole damn thing, and the whole damn thing was what they were getting. Though most of the magic users are relegated to using their abilities to heal and defend, that didn't stop many of them from saying, fuck it, and firing an energy blast into the air. It didn't matter if it was that of wind, water, earth, fire, or electricity, or anything. It didn't matter if it was soul energy. They did not care, as this battle maintained itself. But it was not just magic. I could see cruise missiles flying across the sky, along with all different types of aircraft. Tanks moved across the ground. Infantry fighting vehicles began to fire that terrible 25-millimeter cannon as it began to rip through. Missiles fired everywhere, and I looked and I could see the synergism of science and sorcery here to defend us. However, we were simply being overrun. There were so many of them. Entire planets worth of personnel were coming through the portals faster than we could actually fire ordnance up. I looked over to those that could handle dark magic and told them to try and portal everyone away as fast as possible. However, they had to be shown how that was done by Cassie, and that was when we had to separate. I told her to be careful and to make sure she checks on Talia if she can. And that is the last time I saw her during that battle. I went up to protect as many as I could, setting up my energy shield. Though I was strong, there's only so much I could push against. The ogres had found a way with the dwarves to make their vessels much stronger and their ordnance much harder hitting. If you don't know what it's like, considering holding up a kick pad on both arms as people kick with all their might towards you, this is how it is, how the pressure feels whenever ordnance begins to hit against your shields. Though energy shields are one of the first things we learn, and probably the most focused magic we have, it is still difficult to maintain it for a long period of time. It takes a whole lot of concentration, and I didn't have a freaking green ring to help me out. We continued as best we could, trying to get as many of the civilians out as the militaries began to bring their full might to bear. I saw many of the ogre ships get torn asunder as these the freaking 600-mile cruise missiles came in from a rapid dragon and just ripped wholesale ass across the side of these ships. As strong as they were, they don't take buster bunker bombs that easy. Some of the other aircraft began to drop it's a GBU, whatever in the hell, straight through, and the internal components blew to pieces as we saw several ships just simply collapse as they went to the ground and crushed themselves under their own weight. The ogres that reached the ground came at us with sheer vitriol, all sorts of projectile weapons, energy weapons, melee weapons, and their own massive hands as they began to tear us apart. The magic users again did what they could, but it was more than common to see one trying to hold up a defensive line as several others to its right and left would flank them with firearms and begin to fire away. Those who could help the civilians did, as we tried our best to back away, and it wasn't long till we saw their main ship. Their main ship was nothing to be trifled with, as it looked like one of our dreadnoughts. But that is where they screwed up. The order must have been given, as I was trying to shield everyone in large groups as they were rushing towards the portals, and I saw our own dreadnoughts, Our own space fleet had finally made it through the atmosphere and began to fire on the enemy fleets. They did not think we had this type of ships, but they were working hard, as in humanity was working really hard while we were away searching for different sentient species throughout the universe. Our fleet that went out did not have a lot of guns. We were an emissary group. That is what they were meant to be. The only reason they had infantry on them is because protection is a must. They did not think we actually had the ships and the weapons to face them, but even inside the atmosphere, they turned the sky to fire with all the energy weapons, projectiles, missiles, and everything else that came flying at them. Artillery seemed to hit everything. And as they say, only call artillery if you want to kill everything. I could hear the guns off in the distance firing. Boom, 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 boom. Somebody must have said repeat over the radio because those things must have been burning hot as they just kept on firing. As it seemed during the battle that both dreadnoughts, our main ship, our main flagship that is, was easily a match for the ogre's main dreadnought and took down their dreadnought. We were not expecting a second one to come in, all guns blazing, but this thing didn't stop. Their rage had forced them into a frenzy, and they crashed right into the dorsal side of our ship. Unfortunately, the explosion was enough to take both of them down as they crashed, and we were told to evacuate. There was no way we could hold this area, but we would come back. And everyone had a rage as they watched civilians being torn asunder. In one case, the ogres even grabbed a kid and used that kid as a fucking bludgeon on others. I lost it at that point. I was no longer defending. My killing days are not over yet. As I sent a blade of energy across and sliced an entire battalion of theirs apart. Several of the arms, legs, heads, and even parts of the torsos went flying. They began to focus on me, and I wanted them to do it too, because I was pissed. The ogres may understand wrath beyond the measure of most, but they have never seen human wrath ear its ugly head. And it wasn't just me. All the rest of the magic users, especially those that could not save others, were in an absolute frenzy as we didn't care anymore. And they did not understand humans when they reached the level of no fucks given anymore. It is no longer a fear of death, but a sheer desire simply to take these ogres apart. And we ran into them, and behind us we could hear the weapons fire as any military, police, even militia had come to our aid, and they began to empty all their weapons. And when their weapons ran dry, the ogres looked in shock as they used their weapons as sheer bludgeons. As big as an ogre is, I don't care what type of weapon it carries, but a baseball bat across the knee is going to send it to the ground. And once it's on the ground, they were simply mauled by the humans that were there. I looked at sheer delight, bloodlust now coursing through my veins as I began to tear through each of them. I didn't care that my level of magic was beginning to fade on me. I did not care. I wanted payback. And as we got close, a third dreadnought came through, this one firing all its weapons, sending many of us flying, myself included. I looked up, and swelling all the rest of my energy, I pulled it into a condensed ball into my hands, and as hard as I could, trying to keep it together, it was beginning to come apart. I couldn't quite hold that much energy. It was almost like holding a nuclear reactor in my hands, and as I was beginning to lose control, others came up, and they grasped onto me, sending more of their energies into me. I didn't care if it was light, dark, gray, or whatever it was enough. And as I looked up to the sky, not able to keep myself levitated anymore as I had drained all my energy for this one shot, the dreadnought seemed to level off and start to aim its ventral guns at us, looking to slag this entire area, to clear it of humans because they were willing to take out their own in a sheer burst of wrath. But they did not know wrath yet, as I burst through as hard as I could with that energy, and I strafed it across the underbelly. The energy itself was like a condensed laser as it cut the ship right in half, and I watched as it fell, both pieces to the ground, just smoking from the heat that had come off. And I dropped to my knees, completely exhausted, as I looked in front of me, and less than 100 feet, a half of that ship just landed with a huge crash, crushing everything and everyone underneath. I was done. I could barely lift my head. I was barely able to keep whatever was left of my lunch down. And the last thing I remember before I blacked out was a few soldiers grabbing a hold of me, saying, we got you," as they dragged me away. I must have been super heavy considering how big I am now. But one of them simply rolled me over, put me on his back, and my legs were dragging as I heard him scream that scream of all soldiers when they have got no fucks left except their one mission. I've got you. Ah! As I saw them taking me to a waiting Blackhawk, they threw me in the back, and I blacked out. Throughout the entire world, any ogre that tried to take down a city met the same fate. And eventually, they realized that their wrath maybe not be satiated, but it was subjugated by the wrath of humans, because they had truly not seen it before. Even though they had fought humans before, they had never seen humans come at them with such vitriol, with such anger, with such a blood rage before. Their lines began to pull back, and eventually they began to load their transports. I was unconscious and did not see this, but it was said that they left not with wrath in their eyes, but with fear in their eyes. Throughout Earth and her colonies, a similar scene played out when it came down to the ogres, but they were not the only ones. Though the goblins had been placated, as I was find out most of them, and that the Lamias were finding out that double-aught buckshot will actually do the job to take them out, and that we are not just an easy meal for them, no matter how yummy we might be. And the ogres realized that their wrath was nothing compared to that of a human in a sheer frenzy of bloodlust. There was still 4 others to deal with around the world, and they were not all condensed here in our continent. In actuality, the vampires had focused mainly on the European area, and I found out later that they had realized far too late that they were severely outmatched by what was there. As it turned out, many of the old folklore was no longer folklore. Though I had gone on a few hunting trips to take out some of the more dangerous ones, some of the folklore was only there in waiting for them, seemingly waiting for this battle. The vampires, especially in Eastern Europe, had realized far too late that lycanthropy doesn't just apply to growing too much hair. No, lycanthropy had been spread throughout the area. Those that had been forced that through the initial burst of magic, and those that had chosen to change themselves, were now in a massive pack, and this pack decided that vampires needed to be stopped by any means necessary. And though the pack was severely outnumbered, they again did not fight alone. Not only did humans have their back with whatever firearms they could scramble together, as Europe was not one for firearms, their military still raked the skies with grippins as they ripped into anything they could find. The vampires did not let anything stop them. Their envy of the humans, their ability to bring forth technology and sorcery was something they could not let stand, and their pride blinded them to the dangers as they cut through many of the wolves. However, these wolves did not stop either. They had a bloodlust in them, and they would grip a hold of one of these vampires, and if they didn't rip them apart wholesale, they would tear apart their protective suit. When the protective suit allowed sunlight to get inside, you could see that their skin burned as though it was struck by acid. It steamed in the sun as the vampires desperately tried to cover themselves up. In many cases, the wolves decided to be nasty and simply rip off the mask of these vamps and let them cook in the sun. However, this came to a stop as they realized that there was not just males here, but females and young ones as well. What the hell were they using them for? The pride, or in this case, the envy of the vampires, went far beyond anything they had understood here on Earth, as all their envy had reached their entire population. And though they had to resort to bringing their kids, they did not go down easy, and the wolves, again, were severely outnumbered. Even if the vampire went up several feet, the wolf, in rage, would jump as far as it needed to catch this vampire in the air and take it down, but would usually find itself alone and surrounded by the vamps as well. Soldiers did back them up, but it wasn't just humans either. Even the witches of old folklore decided this is our planet and we are going to protect it. Those out even in the center of the desert decided the planet is worth protecting and began to go after the vampires with everything they could. Even at night when the vampires had the advantage, at least they thought. They could see at night and humans can't. And then they found out the hard way that humans had created night vision and this advantage was gone. However, they did not stop. The vampires continued forward as best they could, but they could not continue as their vessels were caught with more and more fire from not only aircraft, but ground-based weapon systems as well. New suicide drones had flown in mass and began to pummel their front lines, and they found out really quick that these were also incinerary. Though fire itself was not enough to cause the same reaction as sunlight, no one likes to be burned. No one. And this is what began to push them back to their own lines. Not only that, but magic users from around the area began to converge on them, trying to take them down. And eventually, the envy that forced them to fight, that made them unable to stop themselves from engaging with humans of Earth, did not allow them to keep going. It wasn't enough. Eventually, many of them were caught and held prisoner. Why? Because humans had envy as well, and they envied the speed and strength and skill of those that have lived for so long, and they were envious of this and wanted it for themselves. Governments around the world began to fight over the ability to capture them, but it did not matter to those of the old folklore that were now alive and well inside this world. Magic had brought them up, and the wolves did not care. They were out for blood. And the vampires eventually pulled back. They opened the portals themselves, draining all the magic they had with them remaining as they stepped through and closed it behind them. You could see on the other side it was their planet. Of course, their planets were dark, and many of them you could see the blood moon in the background. Only a few wolves had gotten through the portals before they closed, and in one poor guy's case, the portal had closed, leaving behind part of one of its legs and its tail. However, the vampires had totally been routed. It took a massive force, but they didn't realize when you attack Eastern Europe, if you don't come in a force of about at least 40 to 1, you're done, motherfucker. You're just done. Farther over towards England, the dwarves had laid waste to as much as possible. Their ships and fighters were so well designed, it was scary. Even getting into Emerge, the Gripens, a fighter that is designed specifically for dogfighting to make the turns so sharp, was having difficulty keep up. Even the F-22 Raptor was having issues dealing with their ships as they were so unbelievably over-engineered that it was difficult to get a shot on them. However, because they were over-engineered, it was common for them to take just the slightest of scratches, and suddenly they couldn't maneuver worth anything and had to return to get repairs. This made them very dangerous but very, very fragile. Those on the ground found themselves against dwarves that might have been hard to hit because they were so small, but these little fuckers were fast, really fast for their size. They would simply sprint at unbelievable speeds from one side to the other, bringing all sorts of weapons, projectiles, energy weapons, melee weapons again. And when they did, they had such power that they could simply grab a hold of any person and crush the bone in their hands. This was horrifying compared to all the rest because we knew it was going to be difficult to take them down. We knew, however, that they were after something as they brought their ships over into England, and England tried to fight them off, but the massive ships simply went over some of these holding facilities, these strange just warehouses. We couldn't figure out why, not until they started sending down shuttles, and we realized it was the fucking De Beers diamond repository. And then we simply backed away. To hell with them. We don't want these freaking diamonds. We do care about these guys still shooting at us. The rest of Europe was more interested in the fact that as soon as they finished off those diamonds, they headed across towards Italy. And they began to go into Venice and Rome and all the ancient cities as these dwarves began to plunder through the area, going through every single basilica and ripping all the gold out. They began to go into any mosque as well, ripping anything off, any temple that they could find. It didn't matter the faith. It did not matter at all. They were simply there to raid everything. And when you went to stop them, they were more than willing to kill you. The greed of these short little fuckers was unimaginable as they were blinded by all the shimmering, shiny shit that they wanted. It was not until they finally started getting a whole lot of resistance that they decided they would head south across the Mediterranean. But as they went across, they raided one ship. They decided to take whatever they wanted and kill everyone upon board. But as their largest ship began to go across, they found something there that they were not expecting. There is only one existing video of this from a distant fishing vessel. It must have been British, considering what he said, but as the ship went across, you could see the person holding up this shaky video as they watched this massive ship move very slowly for its size, roughly 50 to 100 feet above the water. It began to fire at anything that was close, but then they saw this massive hand reach up, this scale-covered hand, half of a claw almost, as it reached up and grabbed the ship itself, sinking its claws into the side. And you could simply hear the one taking camera go, "Holy fuck me, what is that?" And as the claw started ripping into the armor, the exterior point defense weapons began to fire on it. It seemed to flinch just a little bit, and then another hand reached up several hundred meters away. Another opposite hand, it seemed, as it reached over and slammed both hands together, crushing the ship itself. The ship began to explode from the inside as the reactor seemed to start to rupture itself over, and then the hands both ripped into the hull of the ship and pulled it apart. And as it held two large pieces of the ship, others began to fall into the ocean itself. Then they saw it as their own vessels came back and fired at the hands. The hands seemed to retreat, and then something else began to raise from the ocean. And it was unmistakable. That bald head, those dark sunken eyes, and the tentacled face that looked almost like a beard rose from the deep. I had never expected to ever see it. I had hoped that the magic that had burst across this planet had bypassed it, had let it slumber in peace, but apparently a war on this planet is enough to wake it up, and when it's awake, Cthulhu is really pissed. With a wave of its arm, it began to rip the ships apart. They couldn't seem to get out of its way. It seemed to radiate a type of energy as it just began to walk towards where the dwarves had landed their ships. And it was at this moment they knew they might have fucked up. Because they only had a few choices. Did they head north to the armies of Europe and even Russia that were sending more and more of their vessels, their men, their machines to fight them? Did they head south into the waiting arms of this ancient monster who purely wanted to destroy them? Do they head east so that they could possibly run out of the Mediterranean? Do they head west into the Black Sea where even more ships and more guns were waiting? The choice was clear. They headed straight up. They wanted to get off the planet. They didn't know what was waiting for them out to the east, even though it seemed like open area. They made the right choice because out that way was the entirety of the Atlantic fleets that had come in to try and fight off the dwarves that had been raiding their areas. It was at this point they tried desperately to reach out beyond the range of our weapons, not realizing that the defense fleets were still relatively intact and were waiting for them. They weren't going to fire down onto the planet if they could help it. This would be bad, just bad, if they fired their weapons down into the planet, as a single miss would cause unbelievable destruction. But as the dwarves turned on their engines, turned the nose of their ships towards the sky to try and get out of the reach of this monster that was now climbing out of the ocean, reaching for them and almost jumping up to hit them as they went full burn. They believed they were safe. But as the man says, there's more than 1,000,000 ways to die in space, and they all suck. As they reached the atmosphere, they began to catch fire from all the ships that were simply waiting for them, taking pot shots, trying desperately not to fire weapons that would come back down to Earth. And yet, they still had trouble reaching them because of the magnetosphere and the ionosphere that was difficult to penetrate and difficult to get a lock on. But that did not matter to the dwarves. They were done. They had realized that they had reached beyond their limits. And they had used the technology that they had mixed in from watching the humans, from watching us max out our engines using magic. They had somehow managed to do this with pure science, and they began to open their own gateways. But the magic, it didn't feel like magic. It gave off an almost sickening type of energy. Any type of magic wielder within almost a continent's reach of these gates fell ill immediately. It was to them almost toxic. They had to adjust themselves and try to protect themselves using their powers. Thankfully, the more barriers you had in between you and those gates was enough to keep you protected. Consider it kind of their own Faraday cage. But that was it. The dwarves themselves recalled everything. They were done. They had no interest in what was going on here. And it was around this time, as the big man walked out and simply addressed those on shore. Many of them got down on a knee and showed that they were of non-threat. But that tentacled face simply looked at them, almost with pity, and then turned and went back into the Mediterranean. Wherever it went after that, no one knows, nor does anyone care, but the abilities of him The sudden burst of magic that came across the planet was enough to shake me out of my sleep, though I had difficulty even standing as I was short on energy. I still realized there was a war going on, and there were still others that needed to be dealt with. Though the majority of elves were on the other side of the planet, I realized that the majority of the dragons had come down towards us. Why? I haven't got the slightest fucking clue why they insisted on coming to the US. At least for a time. It wasn't until I saw a few videos of the dragons making their way across and raining all sorts of hellfire wherever they went, blasting with their dragon's breath across the area, that I realized that not just those that had been born on their own planet were there, but those that we had transmogrified were also fighting as well, bringing all sorts of dragon fire wherever they could. Though they did not make it a point to take down our fields of crops, they did stop every few times to end up at one of our feedlots to, well, feed. They didn't seem to have a taste for human like the Lamias did. However, they did need to eat. And I realized that they were searching as they began to rip houses open and look inside, sometimes ripping schools open and looking inside. They seemed to be grabbing several, and then it hit me. Where's Talia? I jumped up and I started reaching for my phone. I was like, where is it? Oh, thank God it's here. Searching through real quick, I dialed her number, and thankfully she answered. Talia, where are you? And she gave me exactly where she was. I searched with my magic, which was difficult because I was so down low on power, but I found her. Reaching in, I tried to open a portal as best I could, but I was having a lot of trouble as I did not understand that type of magic. But eventually, from the other side, as the portal began to open barely the size of a dime, Talia reached up and seemingly effortlessly put her hands in and shoved them to the sides, opening the portal wider so I could step through. I went to her, grabbed her, I said, "Are you okay?" "Yes, we're fine." We're okay. Where are we exactly? Show me on a map or something." She pulled up her maps on her phone and showed me. It's like, okay. Crap. Now what do we do? But that is when I realized something else was close by, as we felt something fly by and shake us, but there was no sudden burst of power as you would think, no sound of turbines in the air. We could feel the power as this dragon landed outside the building and began to use its claws to rip open the front. I burst out in front of it, and it seemed shocked to see me there. It roared and tried to blast me with dragon fire, but I looped down and punched it underneath the jaw, forcing his jaw closed. By the way, that hurts, because the dragon fire kind of looped down inside the mouth and almost shot down the throat. Let's just say ulcers from hell, literally. It then began to take flight, and I jumped up with as much power as I could and looked it square in the eye. And before I could even say a word, several aircraft came in and started peppering it with all sorts of missiles. But it was smart. The dragon saw it coming, knew it, and was able to not only duck away from missiles, but also knock them away with its wings, its tail, and its appendages. However, it was not expecting what came next. The telltale sound, one I had remembered from a long time ago, the same sound that had protected me a long time ago, came through. As I heard the streak of it coming in, I knew somebody had banked their A10 in, and we heard brrrr. Without warning, the dragon could feel those rounds hit it. It couldn't deflect them. It couldn't dodge them. And it just peppered it on the side, puncturing its wings and damaging the muscle. And the dragon itself plummeted to the ground. The dragon landed with a massive thud, and as I lowered down, trying to look it square in the eye, I saw Talia run up and grab it by the nose and screamed, "Daddy!" Boy, didn't I look like the fucking asshole at that point. I lowered myself down as best I could and looked the dragon in the eye, It seemed to almost smile, if it was even possible for a dragon to smile, at the idea of seeing its kid. At that point, I saw that the A-10s were banking around for another shot. I used what energy I could to raise a dome around the dragon as they fired in, and I never thought I would feel pain from holding up a shield like that. But it was like being hit with paintball rounds at point blank range on full auto. That stings. The aircraft pilots must have figured out what the hell I was doing, because they began to do lazy circles around. I knew A-10s don't have exactly the longest of loiter times, so I simply began to wave to them. I tried to get some sort of communications, but I was just too low on energy. Thankfully, Talia came over, and she offered to give me some of hers. I said, "That's a bad idea." She asked why. I said, "He's not going to like it." I pointed towards her father, and of course, he looked at me with a bit of vitriol in his eyes. Thankfully, he had enough magic abilities to link communications with me via telepathy, and we could finally speak. He was still pissed. He claimed that I had stolen his daughter from him, that I had transformed her without his permission, and that she was too young to understand what she had done to herself. She listened to this entire conversation and wanted to say something, but I motioned to her to be silent, to just be quiet and let him vent. He growled in rage and began to stir a little bit, even though it hurt him to do so. He told me that I was beyond any type of retribution, that I deserved any type of pain that I felt because I had done something to his child without his permission. She is again too young. She does not fully understand. She does not comprehend this. As he kept going, I began to walk forward, and right next to his face, I bowed to him. "Sir, you're 100% right. I didn't know how young she was. I really didn't know. And if I had known this, I would never have allowed this to happen." Talia tried to jump in, but we both looked at her, telling her to be quiet. "I am sorry, sir. If I could change it, I would. But if I changed her back now, I don't know what deformations would happen. I just don't know." He began to growl at me a little bit, but I could tell he was mulling it over. "Sir, think of me as her uncle. I am the uncle that will protect her in place of her father. And if she was willing to return home, which I'm sure this is what it's all about, I will open the portal with my own life force if I have to return her home." The dragon seemed to calm with this, as I could feel his telepathy searching through my mind for any type of dishonesty. And then something happened that blew my fucking mind. The dragon itself began to glow. And with this, I could actually hear the aircraft coming in and try to fire another volley. Again, it hurt. This time, it felt like somebody paintballed me in the face. Yes. Ow. But even more painful, as it felt like there was some sort of penetration through my eyes. I wiped my face, trying to fight the pain off, as I watched this dragon slowly, seemingly shrink, slowly changing its form. Though the dragons themselves were not overly massive, as though they're only about the size of a large RV, not counting the tail and head, of course, or the wings. But he seemed to get smaller and denser. And then he came into a type of human form. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I said, "Why didn't you just have her do this before?" Is all I could think as I watched him transform into this humanoid. Without hesitation, Talia ran up and jumped into his arms as he gave her a hug. I still believe that the pilots must have seen this because they immediately banked away. I couldn't understand why. So I had to ask him, why didn't you tell everybody you could do this? We wouldn't have transformed anybody if they can do it themselves. He looked at me with almost a knowing grin, sly, but also kind of embarrassed. We did not know we could do this until you changed us. What? He looked at Talia and stroked her hair. Until you changed us, we did not know we had the power to change ourselves. We never looked into it. It was not our concern. We wanted for nothing. That was our way. Well, shit. If that's the case, what the hell are we fighting for? We come to retrieve our kin. Noble, my friend. Very noble. That being said, you just killed a whole lot of people and you just pissed off a lot of my folks. And you know as well as I do that they're not going to let you off that easy. Perhaps. However, the fact that I can now hold my daughter again was worth all the pain. Speaking of which, I looked over on his back and saw that the rounds had actually penetrated in. Since I didn't have to hold up an energy shield, I used what little bit of magic I could summon to try and get the bullets out of his back so that he could heal correctly using his own magic. Eventually, I was able to see a convoy come up, and I waved them down. Many of them walked up confused because I wasn't using my magic to get a hold of them. I told them I was pretty much out, and they could tell. It looked like I was drunk as I could barely stay on my feet. I motioned and told their commander what was going on and told them that I needed to get on the comms. Thankfully, this put an end to the problem with the dragons as more and more of their kin were brought to them instead of protected from them. As soon as the dragons knew that their kin was safe, they were able to use their own dragon fire to create portals themselves and simply return back. Though some of them stayed, I simply gave Talia a hug as I looked over at her father, who was still in human form, who I really wish was wearing pants, and her mother, who had not fully yet changed, yet when she did finally change down to being human right before they walked through, she was a vision of elegance. I could tell that Talia at one point would look exactly like her, and I kind of laughed. However, this was not the end of things, as we still had one more of the deadly sins to face. We had to face off against those that would never stop and never surrender until their dying breath because their pride would not allow them to. The elves had still brought all sorts of hell across the planet. They had used the technological knowledge of the dwarves, the strength of the dragons. The ogres had also outfitted many of their ships with better weapons, the ones that they realized were effective. The vampires were able to use their magic to bring even more power into their weapons, and they were using the Lamias as ground troops alongside their own, as Lamias did not like the taste of elves at all. They would eat them if they were starving, but there was no reason now, as they had billions more tasty treats to enjoy. This was one thing I'm not sure I was able to handle. I had to sit down, and for the first time in a long time, I was in the back of an LMTV being driven around as many of the soldiers looked at me and started asking me questions, what it was like being able to have so much power. Yet here I am, barely able to stay conscious as I had burned through so much of my abilities. By the time we got to the front lines, I could see that many of the fleet had come down into the surface as they could not fire directly down on the elves. The elves were using their magic to emphasize their energy weapons, and this time they had true energy weapons. These basically lasers were powered up to the point where whatever they sliced into, they would slice through. They would use other balls of energy, kind of like a particle projection cannon, as a explosive. It would fly out at such a speed you could actually hear it cracking through the air. However, they were still vulnerable on the ground, even though the fleet could not fire on them, as that would tear apart the entire planet. The ground forces that they faced now had more wrath than any of the ogres, and they had more power than the vampires had brought to them, as more and more of the creatures that we had originally thought were folklore had come to fight alongside us. This was an amazing amalgamation of different energies, different species coming together, along with the technology that had been pushed forward from more conflicts with these different sentient races. The synergy that mixed against the elves was something that I personally would never want to face. They were able to fight the magic with magic, but then they couldn't fight the ground forces with ground forces, because if you get one of our magic users out of the air along with an aircraft, you're not fighting the ones on the ground. If you shoot them or blast them on the ground, you still have the ones in the air. You can't take off the space because that's a trap. And until they recharge their magic, they cannot create the portals needed. We would find out later that they required vampires to start this, as their magic, like mine, was not compatible with that type of portal. However, we did find out that they could create a site of teleportation, as they would blink themselves around the battlefield to get better positions, sometimes blinking in right behind our soldiers just long enough to fire a few shots, and before the soldiers could spin around to actually engage, they would be gone. They would blink out barely enough time for the soldiers to realize who had just punched their friend's ticket. It was a complete and total melee on the ground and in the air as fighters streaked around, and the pride of the elves would not allow them to back down. Even as they ran out of ordnance, they would try to kamikaze their vessels into ours and try to eject at the last moment, not realizing that we had far more than they did. And for the price of a single mile of land, we were willing to lay many bodies at the floor. We were going to spray the entire ground with blood if need be, just to get at them, and they did not understand that our pride and our protective instinct far outweighed anything they could bring to bear against us. In a desperate attempt to try and leave, they loaded themselves back up on the 4 largest vessels they had. Each of these was about 2/3 the size of our dreadnoughts, the ones that had been taken down. And they began to go up, using what little technology they could to activate a type of booster to get them off the ground. Didn't seem enough, as they continued to be hailed by all sorts of ordnance that came down. Any tanks that were still working, kamikaze drones, shoulder-fired missiles, artillery rounds, anything was being brought in, and they were spending way too much energy on shields. So they decided to burst us again. The same type of burst that came in when they first tried to land. What we didn't know is this burst was originally used to simply slow down their ships so that they could land on the planet, as they had just come out of FTL speed. They had to slow down. But this time they would use the burst to launch them towards the sky at an insane amount of speed. I couldn't imagine what inertia was doing to their bodies as the burst hit from underneath the ships and went out like a shockwave across the entire region, the entire area, the east coast of the United States, all the way past the Mississippi. As the burst radiated out, those of us that wielded magic suddenly were reinvigorated, but to a degree we did not expect. In actuality, it made me violently sick, and I'm just thankful that I kept my innards inside, as I saw one poor bastard shit himself, with just the amount of power going through him. Several around me simply vomited on the ground, as they were not used to this. They were not magic users, but somehow this burst had allowed them to absorb magic themselves, and they were just not ready. And as before, many of our people simply exploded, but not nearly as many as before. Barely 1% had this happen to them, where they simply burst like a zit and ended up all over the place. Many of them were not very good people, as we found out that the majority of those that exploded were prisoners. In actuality, one of the prisons ended up with almost an 80% explosive rate. We still have no idea why this is, but it is what it is. The elves immediately burst up, trying to get out of the way. They did get away from our small arms. However, more missiles came in, and 2 of their ships ended up taking hits strong enough that they ended up plummeting back towards the planet. And many of the elves blinked in around the cities and immediately fell to their knees. They had lost their pride, or thrown it to the side, and simply surrendered to us. The last 2 ships finally went out and created their own portals using their magic. How they were able to do it, I don't know, but they escaped back to their own space. It would not be long after that till the fighting actually ended. The fighting itself was 3 days. That is all. 3 days of a war between planets. And speaking of planets, the colonies did not favor as well as Earth itself, as the colonies did not have the extras inside their oceans, or those that had been laying dormant for so long deciding to fight. They were left on their own, with very few magic users and more technology. What they would find out in the colonies is that humans, well, we have this thing about a technique we call scorched earth, even if it's not Earth. It's also called asset denial, or a good old-fashioned hippity-hoppity get the fuck off my property. Many of the colonies now are depopulated. There's no one there, as many of them decided to blow whatever reactors they had. The burst of energy, heat, and everything else that came across was enough to take out many of the ships and almost all the personnel. Mars itself lost over 70% of its population. We sent the rest of our ships to help, and those of us that were able to transport over went to help as well. Venus did even worse, as all any of the invaders had to do was break the domes and allow the poisonous atmosphere in, and then everyone was relegated to certain areas. We didn't find much left, or many people. Many of the satellites, many of our colonies were still in ruin. One would think that we would have all sorts of rage to go and take our revenge on those out in the stars, but we just did not have the personnel. The war itself had shrunk our population to an insane degree. With the amount of Dragonborns that were now gone, many of them had a massive amount of magical abilities, but now were not able to even be called on. We did not have the ships to go fight the ogres or the elves. The Lamias still prowled the night every once in a while. However, most of their numbers were completely annihilated. However, those that were able to consume enough were also able to breed. Lamias did eventually find their way off this planet. However, it would take a few weeks before they finally were able to steal a shuttle. The dwarves were made peace with. They realized that we had many of the trinkets they wanted, but they were not stupid enough to try and steal it again. And trade with the dwarves came to be. The dragons, still slothful. We go and visit every once in a while, but it's more like visiting a neighbor than anything else. Their justification for coming in, well, it was a justifiable assault. We can't hold them against on that one. The vampires still fear us. They fear everything that we have here. But the one we always worry about is the elves. We worry about the pride of the elves bringing war back to us, and now it's an exclusionary zone, as we don't have the ship's personnel or magic abilities to go in and take them down. We are now stuck in a single sector, and they stretch almost half a dozen. That would be a fool's game. The only ones that are still welcome on this planet are the strangely high amount of female goblins that were left behind. As it turned out, when my niece summoned them, they had to be attracted to her form. If they even had the slightest bit of attraction to her form, the goblins simply became her pets, her slaves. However, if they were not attracted to that form, they still had their own free will and would not submit. That being said, goblins have now been integrated into our society. They have still kept many of their more amorous ways. However, they use it to their advantage. I can't argue with them using it. However, the one thing that has completely and totally changed was the fact that the tieflings, along with those of the beastmen, they have come to Earth en masse, as they do not feel safe out in the void of space anymore. The beastmen, though hiding from the vampires mainly, have found their own place here and are very, very welcome. In fact, dating one is considered more of a status symbol than anything else. That being said, the tieflings have fully integrated into human society. It is to the point where most people will look at one and say, wow, they're pretty, and then continue on with their day. It is not a shock to see one around, except for a few neighborhoods, but it is what it is, and I was grateful for this, as I was finally able to reunite with Cassie. I still remember seeing her after the battle as we ran up to each other and held each other. Unfortunately, she had to basically hold me up as I was completely drained of energy, and I almost collapsed in her arms. She still thought this was funny. All in all, I can say this. We may have faced off against the 7 deadly sins, but they found a simple truth that cannot be denied. Down here on Earth, down here is hell. With all the dark energies, cryptids, creatures, witches, mages, demons, and everything else you can imagine. We're here, and we're not going anywhere. Feel free to visit.